Afternoon, everyone. We're just gonna wait just a couple more minutes, just see if we get a few more folks to tune in. So appreciate all of you joining this afternoon, and we'll just wait just a minute or two more. Well, we have crossed the magic number of 60, so we'll go ahead and get started. And would like to let you know that I appreciate all of you joining us again. It's good to see many of you again. We certainly want to thank you for your consistent participation and patience over the past year and a half. Plus, we want to recognize ADWR staff who have provided much assistance in preparing for these meetings and making sure that these meetings run smoothly. For any of you that may not know who I am Warren Tenney, co-chair of the committee. And as I am sure all of you know, back in March, the committee co-chairs presented an overall report about the 6 issues that this committee had worked on for the previous year and a half. At that meeting, Tim Timur stepped down as co-chair, and Cheryl Lombard stepped up as the new co-chair. And so Cheryl and I have been charged to move the committee forward to look at solutions and strategies to address the identified issues. And so we have been working together over the last couple of months to map out the best way to guide the committee to develop strategies and solutions. I have had the opportunity to work with Cheryl before and have enjoyed her expertise and being able to have the perspective and experience that she's able to bring to looking at these post-2025 issues. And so it is good to be able to welcome you, Cheryl, to your first committee meeting as co-chair.
Thanks, Warren, and thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to the work we have in front of us. It's some of the most important we have as a state. And I think as we'll get into in a few minutes, Warren and I have laid out a doable work plan. It's going to be a busy one. But with that, if someone could advance the PowerPoint to the next slide. This is our agenda, and I believe we have a few webinar logistics that we do want to go into before we start talking about specifics.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and just note to remind all of you, I think we're all well versed at this, but just as a reminder, please state your name when speaking. It's helpful for those who are not who are tuning in and may not see the picture right away. Mute yourself when not speaking. Indicate if you would like to speak, just go ahead and type your name in the chat box and you will be invited to unmute and speak. And please when you do that, message it to everyone in the chat, so that way nobody gets, make sure that we don't lose you anywhere. And this meeting and the chat will be recorded. So just want you to be aware of that. So with those little brief points, let's just go ahead and dive into the agenda, where Cheryl and I can give you an overview of what we're looking at for the next year and a half. So as you're all familiar and has been discussed many times, this committee, the post-2025 AMAs committee, is charged with identifying opportunities or challenges to groundwater management within the active management areas, and then coming up with strategies and solutions to address those challenges beyond 2025. At the March meeting of the Governor's Water Council, we gave an overview of the committee's activities from the previous 18 months. And during that time, the post-2025 AMAs committee focused on the first phase of its goal to identify and document issues. Next slide.
So over the course of several well-attended meetings, the post-2025 committee identified 6 areas of opportunities to improve water management in the AMAs. As you all know, we developed for each issue an issue statement along with written briefs to further describe those actions. At our March meeting, the then committee chairs presented and described the 6 issues, which are categorized, as a reminder, as the hydrologic disconnect, exempt wells, unreplenished groundwater withdrawals, groundwater in the assured water supply, water supplies for replenishment by the CAGRD, and the post-2025 AMA management structure. We all in the committee acknowledge these issues are interconnected, and many overlap on many issues. Plus, the strategies that we're going to focus in on will need to be assessed in relation to the immediate and long-term needs and consequences of the challenges presented in each of those briefs. Following discussions that Warren and I have had, along with probably most of you on this call and DWR, including some differing perspectives, the Council charged the committee to move to its next phase to develop solutions and strategies. So today we're going to explain how we're going to proceed to this next solution phase. Next slide, please.
So Cheryl and I have identified 2 objectives as we move into this solutions phase. First, we want to develop specific strategies and solutions that improve water management in the AMAs that can be implemented within the next year and a half. Why the next year and a half? Because that's the time that we have that remains with Governor Ducey's administration. And we have been viewing this as Governor Ducey's Water Council, and so it was established by him, and so we want to be sure that we meet the charge given us and accomplish something during this time frame, and we recognize that it is a tight time frame. So within the next year and a half, we realize that we must be realistic about what policies can be supported and implemented to improve how we manage water in the AMAs. And we also have a second objective in that we want to have a discussion. We assume that these discussions on broader long-term strategies and solutions can also lay a groundwork and help have momentum for our collective stewardship over water with the next administration. Next slide.
So what does all that mean? So where are we going? Warren and I, after some discussions, after hearing from everyone, we decided it would be best to focus on developing solutions in this next phase for 3 of the issues that have the common nexus across the AMAs. And those 3 are groundwater in the Assured Water Supply Program, unreplenished groundwater withdrawals, and the hydrologic disconnect. These 3 issues affect all sectors and stakeholders across AMAs and are intertwined. We've been working very closely with DWR to pull together additional information and data relevant to furthering our understanding of these issues. and they will be presented at 3 different meetings starting today. These presentations are meant to set the stage for a more informed discussion with the committee and to discuss these issues, ask questions, and suggest ideas for solutions. Next slide.
So what about the remaining issues? We are asking a group of Prescott AMA stakeholders to take a look at how best to address the exempt well issue and how it is interrelated with other management structure issues in the Prescott AMA. This group would then present concepts that they have developed to the committee for further discussion. Regarding the issue on CAGRD replenishment and water supplies, the co-chairs feel that while this is a post-2025 issue identified by the committee, it is not an immediate problem for the CAGRD, nor is it a problem that the GRD are not continuously planning for and seeking to address. The CAWCD board is also aware of and considering the implications raised in the issue brief. The issue brief explained the growing risk after 2025 of obtaining water supplies to meet the CAGRD's replenishment obligations. Obtaining new supplies is also a challenge for all water providers, so we believe this can be addressed with the continued work of the Long-Term Water Augmentation Committee. Yet CAGRD will still be addressed as the post-2025 committee works on the first 3 issues that Cheryl identified. Finally, as we discuss the first 3 issues, potential solutions or strategies may be best executed by making improvements to the AMA management structure. The AMA management structure issue provides an opportunity to review and implement changes to the broader regulatory framework, which we will plan to address if we haven't already after discussing the first 3 issues. Next slide.
So we're going to leave time for questions, but we have a tight frame in terms of how to best generate ideas and solutions. While the 3 issues are interrelated, we believe we will most productive by starting off with a single issue, with presentations and discussions with the committee while accommodating and understanding where there are cross-issue comments or areas. So today we are going to start by focusing in on groundwater and the Assured Water Supply Program. Our agenda will move next to the Department of Water Resources, giving a presentation on the Assured Water Supply issues and what it means for AMA management. And then we would like you to share ideas for addressing this issue. Our next meeting will be on August 10th. We'll be sending out an invite if there isn't already to discuss the issue of unreplenished groundwater withdrawals. Once again, DWR will give a presentation about the current scale and impact of each type of unreplenished groundwater withdrawals in the AMAs, and we will again leave time for discussion. In September, we will be moving to the last issue of the hydrologic disconnect. Again, a presentation followed about a committee discussion. During this time, including in today's meeting, we will keep track of the ideas for solutions that are suggested. Then in September, at our meeting, we will report back on these and follow up in terms of really focusing in on what issues we want to address. Next slide.
So we plan for the committee to continue to meet between October and December so we can discuss which ideas are most realistic to develop further into solutions that would lead to supported policy changes. We would then plan to present to the council in December any policy proposals that the committee has general consensus on. Going into 2022, the committee would continue dialogue on the issues and further consider ideas for solutions and strategies that may not have been developed by the committee. For now, our focus is on 2021 and to have spirited committee discussions to develop new ideas and approaches to these issues that we can build support around and improve water management well beyond 2025. So that is what we're looking at, and appreciate everyone's willingness to move ahead with tackling these tough AMA management issues. Any questions that we can answer at this point? Not seeing any in the chat room. So one of the things that Cheryl and I did want to note is that the CAGRD committee of the CAWCD board has recently discussed issues raised by the post-2025 committee that affect the CAGRD. And we had asked Alex Arboleta, who is the chair of the CAGRD committee, to share her objectives for those discussions. But unfortunately, she's not able to be with us today. But she asked Laura Gregano, the CAGRD manager, to give a brief update. So, Laura?
Thank you, Warren. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Cheryl. Laura Grignano, Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District. And as Warren said, yes, unfortunately, board member Arboleta couldn't be here today due to a previous commitment. So she asked me if I could provide a few words on her behalf today. And she'd like to thank the co-chairs for the opportunity to discuss the steps that the CAGRD and Underground Storage Committee have taken in the last few months to be engaged and informed on what is being discussed at this committee. So some of you may or may not know, but over the last few months, CAP staff has invited those stakeholders who have provided written comments during the post-2025 AMA committee process to come and share their perspectives with the CAGRD and Underground Storage Committee on issues with a nexus to CAGRD. These discussions began in April with the issue of the hydrologic disconnect. We continued in May with the issue of groundwater in the Assured Water Supply Program. And we will wrap up this Thursday with a discussion on the issue of the CAGRD replenishment and water supplies issue brief. So first, a little bit about the process for those of you who maybe aren't aware of how we tried to set these up. In order to maintain a balance of perspectives, the stakeholders, based, like I said, on their comments submitted, were placed into 5 main categories. And these main categories represented home builders and developers, water providers with little to no reliance on the CAGRD, water providers reliant on the CAGRD, environmental non-governmental organizations or NGOs, and university representatives. And in order to best manage our time at the committee meetings, we asked the stakeholders to choose a spokesperson or two to represent their general perspectives and interests on these issues. And each group was given 10 minutes for their presentation or talking points that they wanted to share with our committee. Now, the intent of the series, and this is important, is not to duplicate efforts being led by this committee, but rather to provide a forum for the CAGRD and Underground Storage Committee to hear directly from the stakeholders their perspectives on issues so that they can provide informed feedback and guidance to staff on issues related to the CAGRD, as well as possibly develop principles and make recommendations themselves on these related issues. Now in August, Chair Arboleta envisions a committee discussion on the perspectives that they've heard over the last few months, as well as discussion on next steps the CAGRD and Underground Storage Committee would like to take as the post 25 AMA committee continues into the solution phase of its work. And again, I wanted to thank Warren and Cheryl for the opportunity to describe this process and the purpose of the stakeholder discussions that we've been having. And I think it's been a really valuable process for our committee, hearing all of the perspectives directly from the stakeholders. And with that, I thank you and hand it back to Warren.
Great, thank you, Laura. Appreciate that update on that, on the activities of the GRD committee. Let's just move into the whole reason we're here today is we want to have a good discussion regarding the groundwater and the assured water supply program. And so Cheryl and I worked closely with DWR to have them prepare additional information and data about the assured water supply program. The issue brief provides exactly what it says, a brief description of it, but we wanted to get DWR to give us a little more information and background that makes sure that all of us around this virtual table has the same information and understanding about the assured water supply program, so that we can then have a discussion about what opportunities there may be to strengthen the assured water supply program. So Cheryl, unless you have something more to add, we can turn it over to ADWR.
I think my one thing is during the presentation by the department, how do we want to handle if people have questions about their presentation? Do we want to do it during or save them, or just have them put them in the chat?
Yeah, I would say let's put them in the chat. If it's something that we think can be answered fairly quickly, we can do that, or we can save them for part of the bigger discussion.
Okay, thank you. So with that, I want to welcome our friends from the department. I want to thank you guys for all your hard work on putting this presentation together. So Aisha Vohara, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, is Deputy Counsel for the Arizona Department of Water Resources, and then Jeff Winwood, whom we all know is the Chief Hydrologist for the department. I want to welcome.
Thank you, Cheryl. And it is Aisha Vora. I am Deputy Counsel with the Department of Water Resources. And I will be starting us out with a brief overview of the Assured Water Supply Program with a focus on groundwater supplies. And then Jeff Inwood, our Chief Hydrologist, will take it from there and get a little bit more in depth into groundwater modeling. Next slide, please. So the Assured Water Supply Program was established by statute in 1980, and the implementing rules were adopted in 1995. The rules actually provide the bulk of the details as to how an assured water supply can be demonstrated. The 100-year assured water supply demonstration is required for subdivision plat approval and a public report from the Department of Real Estate. Today, and just a disclaimer, our presentation today is designed to provide a pretty broad overview, and it's not a comprehensive description of all of the assured water supply criteria. We will be going somewhat in depth into a couple of the criteria, but it's not intended to be comprehensive. Next slide, please. And here we have a map of the state with the 5 active management areas where the Assured Water Supply Program operates. And those are the Prescott, Phoenix, Canal, Tucson, and Santa Cruz active management areas, or AMAs for short. Next slide, please. So the Assured Water Supply Program is designed to provide consumer protection to home buyers, but also to sustain the state's economic health by preserving groundwater resources and promoting long-term water supply planning, in particular groundwater management. Next slide, please. So in order to obtain plat approval or a public report from the Department of Real Estate, a landowner of a proposed subdivision can either obtain a certificate of assured water supply for the proposed subdivision or a commitment of service from a provider with a designation of assured water supply. The certificate of assured water supply is issued to a landowner for a proposed subdivision, and in that way it's attached to or runs with the land. Whereas a designation of assured water supply is issued to a municipal provider for their current committed and projected demands. And that designation is attached to the provider rather than to a specific subdivision. Sometimes before obtaining a certificate of assured water supply, a developer may choose to apply for what's called an analysis of assured water supply. An analysis is not an assured water supply determination that can be used in and of itself to obtain plat approval or a public report, but it can be and often is used as a first step in demonstrating physical availability of groundwater. However, it is not a guarantee that a certificate can be obtained at a later date for that groundwater supply. And that is because, over the years, decades sometimes, hydrologic conditions can change and demands can change between the time that the analysis is issued and the certificate is applied for. Also, unlike certificates and designations, analyses are a creation of rule. They are not mentioned in the assured water supply statutes. Next slide, please. So here we have the 7 assured water supply criteria. Physical availability needs to be demonstrated for 100 years as well for the water supplies, as well as legal availability, continuous availability, and that the water supplies will be of sufficient water quality. The 5th criteria is the financial capability needs to be demonstrated to construct the necessary water storage, treatment, and delivery system for the full subdivision or full designated provider demand. 6 and 7 only apply to groundwater supplies. And those require that the groundwater supply be consistent with both the management plan for the active management area and that the supply is consistent with the management goal for the active management area. Next slide, please. So next we're going to jump into physical availability. Specifically, we're going to talk about groundwater physical availability. Next slide, please. So if the proposed source of water for a subdivision is groundwater, the assured water supply applicant needs to submit a hydrologic study using a method of analysis that is approved by the director and which accurately describes the hydrology of the affected area. Generally, this method of analysis must be a numeric groundwater flow model, and the department evaluates conditions and demands across the entire modeled area. This numeric groundwater flow model projection is done as a one-time snapshot in time, if you will. The snapshot in time analysis at the time that the application is submitted. These modeling projections are not a guarantee of a 100-year water supply, and that's because the determination is made up front prior to issuance of the certificate or designation, and demands and hydrologic conditions can change over time. Next slide, please. So now we're going to jump into the 7th criteria, which applies to groundwater, and that is demonstrating consistency with the management goal of the active management area. Next slide, please. So we have different management goals for some of the active management areas. And each of the active management areas has the management goal described in statute, and that's 45-562, the citation at the bottom of the slide. For the Phoenix, Prescott, and Tucson AMAs, the active management area or groundwater management goal is to attempt to obtain safe yield by 2025. And safe yield is defined in statute as maintaining a long-term balance between the annual amount of groundwater withdrawn and recharged either natural or artificial recharge. For the Pinal Active Management Area, the management goal is to allow development of non-irrigation uses and preserve the agricultural economy for as long as feasible, consistent with the need to preserve future water supplies for non-irrigation uses. And lastly, in the Santa Cruz AMA, the management goal is to maintain safe yields and prevent local water tables from experiencing long-term declines. Next slide, please. So consistency with the management goal, this requirement, as I mentioned, applies to groundwater supplies to be included in a designation or a certificate. And the assured water supply rules provide that in the Phoenix, Tucson, and Pinal AMAs, this requirement can be met through any combination of pledged extinguishment credits, groundwater allowance, and enrollment in the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, which is a part of the Central Arizona Water Conservation District. In its member lands and member service areas, CAGRD replenishes groundwater pumped in excess of a certificate or designation's pledged extinguishment credits and groundwater allowance. CAGRD does not operate in the Prescott AMA, so in that AMA, the consistency with management goal requirement can only be met with extinguishment credits or groundwater allowance. We don't currently have rules for how consistency with the management goal can be met in the Santa Cruz AMA. And lastly, enrollment in the CAGRD is merely a mechanism to demonstrate consistency with the management goal for groundwater supplies. It does not demonstrate the physical availability requirement. That must be demonstrated separately through groundwater modeling. Next slide, please. So before I hand this over to Jeff Inwood, I wanted to just go back to the physical availability requirement for groundwater and touch on some key assured water supply groundwater modeling requirements. First, the assured water supply model run must include the total demand of the modeled area, which includes existing uses, as well as issued but unbuilt assured water supply demands, and the individual assured water supply applicant's proposed new demand. The model run submitted by the applicant must also remove long-term storage credits that are not pledged to the assured water supply application. As well, and this is in rule, our depth to water at the end of the 100-year modeling period can't exceed certain depth to water limits or bedrock if bedrock is shallower. And in the Pinal Active Management Area, that's 1,100 feet. In the Prescott, Tucson, Phoenix, and Santa Cruz Active Management Areas, that is 1,000 feet. The last key modeling requirement is that groundwater withdrawals cannot create unmet groundwater demands or depth to water exceedances for previously issued assured water supply determinations, and that includes existing municipal demands. Next slide, please. And here we are at groundwater modeling, and I will pass the presentation over to Jeff Inwood, our Chief Hydrologist.
Thank you, Aisha. Good afternoon, everyone. Jeff Inwood, Chief Hydrologist at ADWR. Just going to do a quick overview of some modeling basics related to the Assured Water Supply Program, and then do a case study with some our Pinal model run that we released and have been talking about over the last couple of years. Next slide. So my favorite slide, Lego Lisa, just wanted to point out that models are a simplification of reality and that they try to represent real-world conditions, i.e. you have the original Mona Lisa, and using Legos can build something that looks very close and represents the original but is not the exact same thing. Next. So just schematically want to show everyone how the modeling process works for the program and state that it's a tool for understanding the hydrologic system and predicting a response. So focusing on the square in the middle, the numerical groundwater flow model, that is the model that we build using what's known as ModFlow, the computer code developed by the USGS, which is an industry standard. We use observed data and develop data sets that go into the model, and we construct the model during a historic period, and we calibrate the model, and that leads to our best available tool. If you then look to the left, where we talk about the 100-year projection run, and what we do with that is we develop assumptions and inputs that follow statute rules and policies, and we run those through the model, and then the run produces results for that 100-year projection period. Those results are then used to make assured water supply determinations. And the key thing that I want to point out to everyone is the difference between the model, that's the calibrated model for the historic time period, and the assumptions that are put into the model that produce the 100-year projection results. So those are two separate activities, and therefore there's the model, and then there's the assumptions that go into the model to run it for the 100-year projection. Next slide. So focusing in on some of the data and data sets, next, go ahead. Just real quickly, these are some of the primary data sets that we developed that are used in the model. They include pumping, evapotranspiration as outflows from the model. Inflows include recharge, various types of recharge like stream and agricultural. Also mountain front recharge, precipitation that flows down the mountains, and then ultimately some of it will get into the groundwater system. And then there's groundwater flow in and out of the system that is also incorporated into the model. And that leads to changes in storage. Next slide. So then just kind of looking back to how we developed the numerical calibrated flow model will be next. Taking a real world situation on the left side, the block that shows I know it's hard to see, but those are farm fields on the left, homes on the right, a stream, and a lake. And then looking vertically, those are 3 geologic units. So what we do with a groundwater flow model is we turn that into a grid system that has columns and rows in the horizontal direction, and those are just established based on the size of the model area that you want to look at. I'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. And then the vertical representation is by layer, and what those layers generally represent are geologic units, and they can vary. Some models can have 3 layers, they can be 1 layer, they could be 5 layers. There's no limitation on that. Next slide. So when you put the columns and the rows and the layers together, what you end up creating is a model cell. And each model cell has its own hydrologic properties. And as I was explaining before, the columns and rows are determined when you build the model They are typically, in regional groundwater flow models, half-mile row, half-mile column. Sometimes they're mile by mile, which can be very, obviously, a large area that they cover. Then the layers can be variable from tens of feet to thousands of feet. So, and they can be variable. Each cell does not have to be the same height or vertical direction. Those can be variable. Next slide. So then, just want to talk real briefly about the different types of models that have been used by the department or applicants in the past, and what we've been shifting to in more recent times. Analytical versus numerical models. Obviously, the department wants to use the best tool available because that will enhance the consumer protection, will produce the more robust model and more robust and reliable results. So the old model on the left, we have it represented by an old rotary phone, is kind of what we think of an analytical model. They're much more simplified models. They're two-dimensional. They only deal with groundwater flow in horizontal direction. They're not calibrated, but on the good side, they're much easier and faster to develop. Looking at the newer model, the cell phone model, is a numerical model. Those are three-dimensional flow models, so you get the vertical component as well. And they are generally good for complex hydrogeologic systems. They are calibrated to observed or historic conditions like water levels or stream gauges. And the downside is that they do take a longer time to build and construct, and generally require some expertise in order to develop them. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go back to item 4 of the modeling requirements that Aisha discussed, and specifically I'm going to zoom in on the unmet demand and talk a little more about that. Next slide. So unmet demands occur when the model cannot simulate the pumping of all demands that are put into the model, thereby creating a shortfall or a deficit of pumping. To simply put, if you put in the model you want 100 acre-feet to meet a demand, but it only will produce 80 acre-feet, you'll have a resulting 20 feet of acre-feet of unmet demand. I kind of look at it as from a financial standpoint. If you put all your accounts together and you want to get $100,000 out, but you only have 80,000 in there, you can't get it all out. So drilling down a little, two examples here, schematics of how the unmet demand occurs. And in the first example there, a model cell is dewatered. You can see that the water level, the blue dashed line, is below the depth of the water of the well, and it's also resting on the bedrock. That means there's no more water in below that well to be recovered or pumped out. The second case is that the aquifer just cannot produce the water. Even if there is some water level above the bottom of the well, it still cannot actually pump it out. The second example is when the water level falls below the depth of the well, even though there's still water in that cell. As you can see, the blue line is below the depth of the well, but there's still water below that well. And in this case, above the 1,000-foot depth to water. So those are the causes of unmet demand, and I'm going to be discussing unmet demands in relation to the Pinal modeling work we did momentarily. And that leads me to our Pinal case study. Again, this is a modeling effort we did a couple of years ago, and I'm going to try to cut through down to the basics of this just to give an idea of the results primarily. Next slide. But to understand the case study, I need to give a little history, which is that prior to 2013, assured water supply applicants generally submitted analytical models or local numeric models, essentially small area models, generally just covering the developments that they were applying for. These were the best tools, modeling tools available at the time. These models did not consider regional conditions or regional demands, and they did not assess the cumulative impacts across the whole modeled area or basin or subbasin. So in 2014, ADWR developed and released a regional numerical groundwater model that was developed several years in development. It doesn't include the whole Pinal AMA. It includes the Maricopa Stanfield and Eloy subbasins in the northern portion of the AMA. Next slide. Then in 2019, we developed and released an updated numerical model, and then ran a 100-year assured water supply projection run. And that's what I'm going to be presenting on here momentarily in the following slides. But just to point out that for the assured water supply determinations, we need a single answer. So our 100-year projection is a deterministic model run. That means one scenario. It's not a planning tool, so we do not run multiple scenarios and look at the different outcomes that would be the result of each of the scenarios. So that means we put in one set of assumptions and inputs, and it produces one set of results. Next slide. I'll leave this up for a moment and talk about it so everyone can look at this slide. And what you're basically seeing here is the total demand by water type or sector for the entire 100-year projection period. So I'll just briefly run through. The table on the upper left is the assured water supply demands for the model. For the analysis of assured water supply, this represents uncertificated portions of an analysis. If there was a certificate issued against that analysis previously, that demand is removed, so it's only the uncertificated analyses that are included. The certificates, the demand for that is the unbuilt issued certificate volume. So we did analysis to count homes and see and take those out of this demand column, and we assume that those homes that are built are already considered in the existing uses side, which I'll get to momentarily. And then the designations are just what they are, the designations that have been issued. They are put in at their full issued volumes with one exception. That's for the city of Eloy. Their approved designation was somewhere in the order of 30,000 acre feet, but they have a pending modification to 2,000 or 3,000 acre feet, so we reduced the demand in the model to that smaller amount. So the assured water supply demand total is about 21.5 million acre feet over 100 years, which represents 27% of the total demand over 100 years. To the right of that table are existing uses. You can see that by far agricultural uses are the largest, over 48.5 million acre feet, or 60% of the total demand over the 100-year projection period. The other demands, municipal, some M&I uses on Gila River Indian Community, as well as some industrial uses. The total existing uses are 43.4 million acre feet. And then the bottom as Aisha mentioned previously, we have to remove long-term storage credits from the model run because this model run was done not for any specific applicant, so therefore all the long-term storage credits have to be removed. The existing ones as well as ones that are generated during the 100-year projection period for GRD replenishment. I'm sorry, not GRD replenishment. Those long-term storage credit demands total almost 5.8 million acre-feet. Next slide, please. So this is a summary slide that kind of totals up each of those major categories, 21.5 million acre-feet for the assured water supply, 53 million plus for the existing uses, the long-term storage credit removal, nearly 5.8 million, for a total 100-year projected demand of all those uses of 80.6 million acre-feet. So again, keep that number in mind as we go forward. That's the total amount of demand that was put into the model for the 100-year projection purpose. Next slide, please. So here, showing you the total demand that was put in the model and what we were able to simulate, and therefore what was not met creates the unmet demand. So I'll walk through this. So again, looking at the total 100-year projection period, as I mentioned, the total demand put into the model was 80,648,000 acre-feet. When we ran the model that could only simulate, get out 72.5 million acre-feet, which leaves total unmet demand, the difference between those two numbers, of a little over 8 million acre-feet. Next slide, please. Now, looking at that a little over 8 million acre-feet of unmet demand total, wanted to break that down by the use or sectors that the demands were outlined previously. So the assured water supply unmet demand, just under 1.9 million, almost 2 million acre-feet. The agricultural component is a little over 5 million acre-feet. Existing municipal and industrial uses unmet demand, a little under 1 million acre-feet. And the long-term storage credit removal, about 276,000 acre-feet. So that's how you get to the 8 million total. Again, there's a definition of how take total demand minus the simulated demand, and that gives you your unmet demand. The 8 million acre-feet is a large number. But let me provide some context as far as how it relates to the assured water supply program. Not all of that unmet demand necessarily has to be fixed or corrected or eliminated. As Aisha said earlier, new assured water supply determinations cannot create unmet demand in existing assured water supply determinations. So obviously the assured water supply unmet demand would have to be met and corrected for anything to go forward, as well as the existing municipal uses, which is a component of that 782,000 acre-feet that's listed there. But in practical purposes, it's really not prudent to think of it as that you can just focus on one type of unmet demand elimination. As you'll see here momentarily, the unmet demands are widespread throughout the model area. And so in reality, you're going to have to make significant improvements on all the types of unmet demand to eliminate the assured water supply unmet demand. Next slide, please. And this slide, I just want to show to explain that the timing of the unmet demand is critical. And what this graph shows is the total model demand, which is the blue line listed as assigned, and the simulated model, what can get out of the model demand in the red. The black line in the middle represents the year 2015, which is the demarcation between the historic period to the left of the model run, which starts in 1923, and then to the right is the projection period. And I know the numbers are kind of small in the years at the bottom, but I can tell you that you start to see the divergence between the red and the blue line on the right side of the screen in the early 2030s. So we start seeing unmet demand, which is the difference between the red line and the blue line, starting as in the 2030s. So this is not a, well, we have a problem in 100 years. The problem starts much sooner than that, in the 2030s. So the unmet demands get worse over time, that the spread between those two lines increases, but it begins in the very near future. So the timing of the unmet demands is critical when looking at the solutions going forward. Next slide, please. I'm going to try to, in a plan view on the left and a 3D with some vertical exaggeration on the right, try to talk about the locations of the unmet demand as well as the geology of the modeled area, because that does impact how the unmet demands are occurring. So on the plan view map on the left, you'll see the modeled area in green. You'll see a lot of circles. I'll explain those because I know the legend's probably hard to read. The orange circles represent wells with unmet demands for analyses of assured water supply. The blue dots equal wells with certificate of assured water supply unmet demand, and the black with red circles locations represent wells with unmet demands for designations of assured water supply. The light gray circles represent wells non-assured water supply unmet with non-assured water supply unmet demands. As I mentioned earlier, most of the unmet demand outside of the assured water supply, the largest percentage is related to agriculture. So in showing this spatially, you can see that while the unmet demands are spread out through most of the whole modeled area, the majority of the certificate and analysis unmet demands are kind of located in an area north and south of Casa Grande. This is an area that's been identified as the Casa Grande Ridge. And so shifting over to the right side of the figure is a 3D representation of the bottom of the model, i.e. where technically bedrock would occur, except on the two, the far left and the far right, there's a flat area that represents the bottom of the model. That's not necessarily depth of bedrock. That was just where we stopped. We cut off the model bottom, and that's at 3,000 feet. So I'll get into some more explanation of this. Next slide, please. So again, want to focus in on this area called the Casa Grande Ridge, and what that represents. First, let me tell you that that 3D representation is tilted a little, so that's why it's not exactly north and south like the plan view map. But if your eyes and your computer are good enough, you should be able to tell that there's a bedrock high that is what is considered the Casa Grande Ridge. The depths of bedrock there are much shallower than out to the west and east of the Casa Grande Ridge, out near the center of the Eloy subbasin to the right and the Maricopa Stanfield subbasin to the left. So there just is not as much aquifer in this area as there is out to the centers of the basins. And again, the certificate and analysis unmet demand is pretty much focused in this area. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a little heads up. I know it's a black screen here. What this is going to be is an animation that's going to show two maps, one on the left, which will present depth to water, and one on the right that will show saturated thickness of the aquifer, the regional aquifer. And what this will show is over time, it will be running through year by year through the 100-year projection period. So starting out in year 2016, each year through 2115. And so what you'll see is you'll see the change each year. We have a color-coded map for each year, depth to water and the saturated thickness. And you'll see that how it changes over time. You'll also see, as the animation runs through, you'll see black circles come up, and these will represent the places where the unmet demand starts to occur, and you'll see where those places are. Once this runs through, it'll end on the year 2115. Once we get there, I'll then talk about some of the depth to water issues, which is the second part of the criteria that you cannot create unmet demands and you cannot exceed the depth to water limit, which in the Pinal AMA is 1,100 feet. Go ahead and play. We approach 2100, you can see the color patterns have changed from blues and greens to more oranges and yellows and some reds. So there we have the results in 2115. I first want to give a shout out to Diane Yunker from our staff and the modeling section who created this. I think it's a fantastic tool to see how things change over time. So again, I know the legends are hard to read, so I'll kind of zoom in on some of the key points from this slide. On the left, again, the depth to water, focusing on the yellow, oranges, and reds. So the yellow colors represent depth to water from 400 to 600 feet. The browns are and quasi-browns represent depth to waters from 600 to 1,000 feet, and the red in the southeast portion of the mapped area represents depth to water in excess of 1,100 feet. Therefore, in those areas, they're exceeding the depth to water criteria. There are also, it's hard to see, but there are some small squares and in this area. Those represent dewatered cells, but they're hard to see. So this animation is on our website. If anybody wants to find it, you can look at it more in-depthly. So again, the takeaway here, after 100 years, there's a lot of orange, a lot of yellow, and some red. So the depth to water criteria, although is only exceeded in a small area in the southeast portion near Eloy, other portions throughout a large area of the model show very deep depth to water in up to 800, getting close to 1,000 feet. So takeaway that although the depth to water criteria isn't exceeded in a lot of areas, that still have some significant declines in water levels over the 100-year projection period. Next slide. So takeaway, what we've learned, I think it's pretty obvious that groundwater supplies in the Pinal AMA are limited, and there is significant unmet demand that is widespread throughout the modeled area. And that leads to this takeaway, that groundwater is a finite resource. Through the program, we've been allocating water since 1980. Groundwater is finite, and therefore what has occurred in the Pinal AMA will occur in every other AMA in the future. Next slide. And then the director has delivered this message in many forums over the last couple of years, but we always want to take the opportunity to reiterate that we, everyone involved, must continue Governor Ducey's commitment to upholding the consumer protection and water supply objectives of the Assured Water Supply Program. Next slide. And here are some links to the rules, some policy statements that on hydrologic studies and well pumping redistribution. And I think that covers what's on there. And I think, next slide, I think I'm done. Warren, I guess I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Aisha, for the presentation. A lot of good information there that you walked us through. Want to see if anyone has any questions for Jeff or Aisha at this time. I'm not seeing any in the chat room. Rob, were you? Oh, here we go. Sorry, I spoke too soon. Dave Roberts has a question, and then Sharon Megdal. So, Dave.
Thank you, Warren. Can I go ahead?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question for Jeff about the statement at the very end that what has happened in the Pinal AMA will actually happen in all the AMAs. And are you suggesting that we already have a lot of unmet groundwater demand in the Phoenix AMA and the Tucson AMA? Or can you clarify your statement on that?
Sure, Dave. So it's a general statement, but there are places in the Phoenix AMA where we do have dewatered cells. They aren't impacting assured water supply determinations at this point. So we also have depth to water, getting down in the 900 feet plus range in certain portions of the AMA. So there are places within the AMA where both unmet demands and depth to water conditions are getting exceedingly close to the limits. Tucson is a little different. It's not, there are still some dewatered cells, I believe, but the depth to water and unmet demand situation is not as prevalent there as my understanding.
And this is Aisha, just piggybacking on what Jeff just said. I think some clarification is helpful. So thank you, Dave, for raising that question. The Pinal situation is unique in that the regional numeric groundwater flow model that Jeff described to you was not created. We hadn't done that model run until after assured water supply determinations had been issued under previous less sophisticated modeling. And so that is how we ended up in the situation where this first model run using this new numeric groundwater flow model showed significant unmet demands already. In the Phoenix AMA, we're fortunate, and Tucson, we're fortunate in having these regional numeric groundwater flow models established and in use already, so that the idea is to prevent a situation such as in Pinal, where we have unmet issued demands. And feel free to clarify, Jeff, if you need to clarify anything I've said.
No, I think that was a nice supplement to what I was saying. Yeah, we have the models and applicants are using them in Phoenix and Tucson AMAs. So the Pinal model was later in the game. So I'll leave it at that.
So
Thank you. I think that answers my question. I appreciate it very much.
thanks, Dave. Sharon, you have a question? Sharon McDowell?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeff and Aisha, for a very informative presentation, understandable. My question is kind of simple, and it may be a proverbial drop in the bucket. But Jeff, as you know, many of us on this call have been following the Pinal situation through the stakeholder group there and the discussions of the modeling assumptions. And in one of your graphs or diagrams, you showed how deep wells are affects the results. And I wondered if the results would change much or how much if you incorporated drilling deeper wells, if that question makes sense. Thanks, Jeff.
It does, Sharon. Thanks for that. I'll give you some of the assumptions. I didn't want to get into all of them because I'd be here for hours. But as far as well depths, for any assured water supply demand that's unbuilt, we simulated the pumping. We constructed the wells assuming they would be constructed to the full depth of the aquifer. So for those future wells that aren't constructed yet, we simulated them at the full depth. For existing wells and existing pumping from those wells, we used the known well construction information. There have been discussions with the stakeholder group about deepening those existing wells. Because for municipal providers, because that would likely be what would happen if they need to deepen their wells to, if the water levels decline or they want to extend the life of those wells. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess it just brings the point that for those with existing wells, the results would be different if you change the assumption about depth to wells. I just wanted to bring that out. Thank you very much.
Sure.
thanks, Sharon and Jeff. Rob Anderson.
Thanks, Warren and Aisha and Jeff did a nice job with that. I don't have any points of disagreement with that presentation. I guess this isn't really a question. This is really more of a statement, but I do think it's important when we talk about these models that we keep one kind of big picture issue in mind, and that is that the models really post-date. Jeff already alluded to this in his presentation, but the models really post-date the rules and the way we previously determined whether water was available. But the models also have a number of legal and regulatory constraints in them that mean they don't necessarily reflect what the actual real world will look like. Now, I'm gonna just point out 3 or 4 of these. And Jeff, if I get this wrong, please correct me. But first thing is that the unmet demand is basically you take all of these issued demands and you start them from day one as if they were operating at full bore. So on your chart there, you show a sudden jump in water demand in 2015. That isn't going to happen. What'll happen is that line will go up gradually. But the point the reason the department does that is that you want to look at a 100-year picture of how these demands operate in a 100-year picture. So that's the first thing, is that demands will ramp up in a relatively slow way. The second one is that effluent really isn't in this model. And that's largely a legal constraint, because an applicant for an assured water supply oftentimes doesn't control the effluent. It's controlled by the city, it's controlled by the utility, and therefore it's not in the model. And that, I think, would make a significant effect. The third thing is the projected demands. Most of these demands were issued 10, 20 years ago. Houses used more water per capita than they use now. Two more things, and then I'll stop. One is the CAGRD replenishment is not in here, and there's a reason for that. The GRD water supplies are not 100-year supplies, and they're acquired oftentimes after the approvals are issued. But it's not in the model, and if GRD doesn't perform, many of these unmet demands will never appear. You won't get a certificate. And then I guess the last point is that there's significant assumptions based on egg pumping. How long will egg be out there? 80% in the model is egg pumping. And we are making some presumptions over the next 100 years of how egg would use water, and whether egg would continue to use water if water depth dropped to the level that they added into. Anyway, my net point is that there's a lot of things that go into these models that we don't account for that would make the situation significantly better. That's all I have.
Thanks, Rob. Aisha or Jeff, any response or comment, additional information, or not?
This is
Thanks,
Michael
Warren.
Curtis. Michael Curtis would like to comment on the comment about ag. And has anybody tried to put together a model on projected energy costs? And because the idea that farmers are going to farm when they can't either afford the water because of the energy or other costs, has anybody started to prepare some type of algorithmic, arithmetic, or other formula to show that agriculture may decline far more rapidly than is projected?
So, Aisha, I'm not aware, Michael, at this point, but Aisha, I'll let you go back to, you were going to say something in regards with Rob's comments.
Thanks, Warren. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on one of the points that Rob made regarding the model not incorporating CAGRD replenishment. The Pinal model does incorporate CAGRD replenishment at a volume that is included in the CAGRD plan of operation, and that is, I believe it is 15,500 annually. And please correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right.
On that,
That's
Jeff.
right. I missed that. You're correct, Aisha. That's correct.
And regarding the agricultural assumptions, the department now, we're getting a little bit into the weeds here. For areas that are currently farmed that have an assured water supply determination issued on them, such as an analysis or a certificate, in the assured water supply modeling projections in Pinal, we do convert that agricultural pumping demand to the assured water supply demand. And in some instances, or I believe in most instances, the assured water supply demand is lower. But again, it's complicated when you take agricultural recharge into account, but getting a bit into the weeds on that. And we did actually incorporate some additional, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but I believe we incorporated some additional agricultural ag district pumping demand reductions in the Pinal model based on information we received from a couple of the districts.
Yes, Aisha, we did for Central Arizona Irrigation and Drainage District, as well as Maricopa Stanfield. So we called it urbanization. So there was a decrease in ag pumping for those districts over time in the projection period. So that is correct.
Okay. Thank you. Doug Dunham, you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thanks, Warren. Thank you, all the staff there at DWR, a very impressive presentation. I always love seeing the Lego Lisa and the, it's a great representation of the changes from reality to what the model is looking at. First, I just wanted to start off with kind of echoing what Sharon pointed out, that deepening wells, existing wells, as a municipal water provider, I'm going to chase the water. I have customers, I can't let them go dry. So that's always been an assumption in the past that the department has used in some of the other modeling. So I would encourage the department to work with stakeholders in the Spinell model to go ahead and do that. We will add wells in other locations. We will chase the depth. That's just our responsibility as a municipal provider. Next is probably maybe a question, philosophical point, and I'll let the department respond. And then I have a very specific in the weeds question. So the larger one was, I fully understand and support the basic assumption in the Assured Water Supply Program of protecting issued determinations, previously issued determinations. In my mind, that's no different than the well impact reviews the department does. If you're there, you've bought a house, you moved into a subdivision that has 100-year supply, and then all of a sudden a big new subdivision comes in next door, and they are in a better producing part of the aquifer and they dry you up. That's really not an assured water supply. You've lost your consumer protection. But my philosophical question there is, how do we justify and provide some common sense to the fact that the way the model reacts is we can have a subdivision that has been issued, and then a very small demand, subdivision way on the far outskirts of the aquifer has this cascading effect all the way across hundreds of miles, perhaps, across an AMA, and negatively impact. It just doesn't seem that the model reaction there is going to reflect reality over a 100-year period. Although, the model shows that. So has the department thought about how that's really going to play out in reality over time? And then my very specific question is the demand piece that Jeff pointed out, the future long-term storage credits. I have absolutely no idea what that is. Could you please describe that in greater detail so I have a better understanding?
That's a lot to unpack there, Doug. I'll dive into the long-term storage credit. Aisha, did you say something?
No,
No.
Please go ahead. I'll jump in after you.
Okay. So again, we have to, for accrued credits and for future credits that are going to be put in through GSF, we have to remove those from the model. So even pumping those, we still can't simulate pumping all of those credits.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Doesn't make sense to me. Maybe I'll follow up with you offline on this instead of going around in circles on this meeting. It still doesn't make sense.
Yep. Give me a holler. We'll talk.
Okay.
So, Aisha, did you have some thoughts on the other question?
Sure. So I believe there were a couple other questions from Doug. One of those was regarding unmet demands in the model and the requirement to protect issued assured water supply demands. And then the other was a question about, or a statement rather, about deepening wells. And I'll touch on the first one I mentioned, which was the unmet demand point that Doug was making. Specifically in the Pinal model, which is the context within which we've been dealing with this unmet demand question, the magnitude of the unmet demands is so great that it is not conceivable to the department that new assured water supply demands would not contribute further to the unmet demands that are already existing in the model. We're not yet dealing with that issue in the other active management areas, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff. And then regarding the well deepening, I will pass that over to Jeff, if that's all right with you, Jeff. If not, I can attempt to tackle that.
No, I had forgotten about that. So while deepening wells is something the department is open to, and understand Doug's point, and we agree that water providers are going to do what they have to do to serve, so deepening makes sense. The thing to keep in mind is if you deepen the well, you will also pull more water out of that, which will also decrease water levels over time. So and could expand unmet demand in other areas. So just a tale of caution when you can get more water out of a well. If you deepen it, it can have some other impacts that are not so favorable. Anything else, Aisha?
I don't think so.
Well deepening is not a panacea. It does have potential cascade effects. I understand that, but I think that's something we should take a look at for Pinal. And I guess I totally understand your point of we're starting with such a huge hole on the unmet demands, but more philosophically speaking, for the program writ large, how can we explain to folks that a very small demand in one corner of the AMA has a cascading effect in the model that in reality we're probably never going to see just because of the distance. So it's nice to have a black and white guidance, but we need to be able to apply some reality to that. And with that, I'll let somebody else take up your time.
Thanks, Doug, and I appreciate. I know we've got a couple of other questions, and I appreciate the questions so far. I just wanted to point out that these questions are really good and helpful. We wanted to make sure that we really get in and understand the Assured Water Supply Program. And we had asked DWR to talk a little bit about the Pinal situation so that everyone, I know many of you are well familiar with it. Others on the meeting are not as familiar. And we wanted to look at it not so much to, we recognize that there's the Pinal AMA stakeholder group that's working on specifically the Pinal issue, but we were wanting to be able to look at the lessons, see what we could learn from the situation in Pinal, and to recognize how what potential impact we could see in all of the AMAs eventually. And so with the goal being, is there ways that we could strengthen the Assured Water Supply Program when as Jeff pointed out at the end, that the other AMAs could sometime in the future be facing similar situations as what Pinal is facing now. Is there a way what ideas might there be to strengthen the Assured Water Supply Program to help it make it so that we're not just immediately bumping into a wall, that we are crashing into the wall, that we can do it more gradually. Any ideas that would be great. So I just wanted to put that out there as we're going through these questions. And so, Cheryl, I don't know if you wanted to add anything more on what I just said, as to give a little more background.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I view it simply as the knowledge to get ahead. Everything Warren just said, it's really just so we as a committee can really have this equal knowledge and use it so we can get ahead of the problem.
Exactly. So, Terry Sue, you have you're next with your question.
Yes, I'm wondering, can we go back to slide 14? I have a question specifically about slide 14. I think it's slide 14 if I got it. I wrote down the right number. Oh, no, it's not. Oh, wait, yeah, it is slide 14. I'm just wondering, where does this language come from? Does this come from statute? Does it come from rules? Where do these guiding principles come from?
These guiding principles are not verbatim in any of the statutes or rules. This is the legislative intent behind the Assured Water Supply Program.
And is that drawn from like a legislative history that's been done, or is there actually something, like there's, like is there like something in writing that describes those in terms of the legislative history, or is this people's memories?
So I'm going to be completely honest and say that it's been a while since I've looked at the legislative history for the Assured Water Supply statutes, but I have, and my recollection is that that was the impetus behind the legislature passing the Assured Water Supply statutes.
Okay, all right. And then I have also a question about the analyses relative to the GRD demands. Does the model include any replenishment by the GRD associated with the analyses? Does any of the 15,500 acre feet cover the analyses?
My recollection is that it does not. That 15,500 is taken from the plan of operation. And again, it's been a while since I've dug into that, but and if anybody from CAGRD, if Laura, if you're able to, if you want to jump in, please feel free, but I don't believe it does.
Well, thank you, Aisha. In the plan of operation, and you were correct with the number that you gave previously on the 15,500 number. The plan of operation requires us to estimate obligation of our current members as well as members that may enroll in the GRD in the subsequent 10 years during the planning period. And so there are assumptions for new members to enroll. And so I would assume that some of that could be potentially in analyses that already exist, but that's really based on projections of population growth and where the population might be growing and what providers might be providing that water. So don't know if that answers the question, but there is some projection of new members enrolling in the planning period that weren't currently enrolled when we developed the plan.
And so, Laura, are those in the Pinal AMA, are those subdivisions that, were analyses and maybe are, become certificated during the planning period? How much of their demand is expected to be replenished? Or do you know offhand? Or maybe somebody else knows the answer to that question.
I'm not sure I totally I think the numbers that are in the plan of operation, all of that current and projected membership would, that obligation would be met in the model. I just don't believe that the department, because the plan of operation is only approved for the 2015 plan of operation is approved, and until the next plan of operation is approved, I don't believe the department then includes any additional, there's no future guarantee until that next plan of operation is approved that the new enrollees would be receiving replenishment by the GRD. They may be able to acquire a certificate of assured supply through another means, but it's not being modeled through the GRD replenishment, if that makes sense. And I don't know if ADWR wants to jump in.
Well, this is Jeff. We aren't assigning the GRD replenishment obligation to specific subdivisions. It's just a volume of water that we're modeling, and we're putting it in primarily through GSF storage. So I can't, if you're asking which, or is it certificates or analysis or both, that I don't, in our modeling, we don't get that detailed. That's just the number that we put in as a replenishment and model that each year. Does that help you, Terry Sue?
Yeah, I get that there could be a blend. I kind of understand what Laura's saying. I guess I'm just wondering that you showed a number earlier of what the demands were associated with the analyses, and I guess I'm wondering what portion of that would we expect would be replenished, assuming that those came to become certificates. Like, for example, the Pinal AME, I think, post January 2019, all of that would have to be replenished, if I recall correctly.
So I think this goes, sorry, Jeff, do you want to go ahead?
No, I think you were going to say it. Go ahead.
Okay. So I think this goes to the, to something I touched on in my presentation earlier, and that was the difference between demonstrating physical availability and meeting the consistency with the management goal requirement. The department does incorporate in its modeling assumptions replenishment in the Pinal AMA consistent with what is contained in the CAGRD plan of operation, but the department is not using CAGRD replenishment to demonstrate physical availability for individual analyses, certificates, or designations. And I also wanted to shout out Natalie. Thank you so much for pointing out a portion of the code that I hardly ever have reason to look at, and that's 45401, which is the basis, which really does contain the legislative intent for the entire groundwater code, including the Assured Water Supply Program. Jeff, do you have anything to add?
No, that's exactly what I was going to say, the consistency versus physical availability demonstration.
And then Sandy, Terry Sue, is that good? Or did you have another question? Okay, thank you. And Sandy, you had a question.
Thank you, Warren. And really, it's a kind of a follow-on to Dave's comment about the statement, that the other AMAs are going to be running into these same problems. But it also ties into what you said, Warren. We need to identify solutions, and you're really using the Pinal AMA as an example of what could happen, although they definitely have a different goal, and there's other issues afoot there. But the question really comes down to, has DWR provided sort of publicly sort of the baseline assumptions that are in each of the models? So the Pinal, Phoenix, and Tucson models, is there a comparison, and are all the baseline assumptions the same regarding the GRD, utilization of the GRD, and how far that will go, how recharge works, all of that. That I think that would be helpful for people to understand so that we can identify potential solutions. And then really just a comment, I think you've heard some solutions here today. Rob and Sharon and Doug in particular have pointed out some options, and I don't want to lose those as options. And I think you need to put those on the table. I think that's what they were saying, is that these are possible alternatives to look at. Some of us probably know better than others on how that'll affect the model, but I think in order for everybody to be at the same sort of level of understanding and be able to make a good recommendation, we need to understand how those will, are those viable options, how they will, impact the model or not. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Sandy. I've been taking lots of notes, and I'm sure Cheryl has been too. So, but as well as DWR. But I wanted to, but in regards with your question that you have, does Aisha or Jeff, do you want to address that as far as regarding the baseline?
Well, so every AMA is different with different conditions. So trying to put all the AMA assumptions exactly the same and, treating them all the same doesn't work. So I don't know if that necessarily is an objective, but we try to, in each of our model reports when we put them out, try to define the basic and key assumptions without going into the weeds on everything, because there are a lot of things that go into it. So most of our reports do get into that, describing the assumptions, and we will always welcome calls or contacts to discuss them in more detail, like Doug wants to get into with the long-term storage credit removal. So I hear you, Sandy, but it's just really not practical or I think doable.
Yeah. Well, and
to do it that way.
More detailed than what I'm suggesting. I'm talking about more of the policy on how the GRD is handled, how long-term storage credits are handled. Are they handled the same across all the models? Not the detail, I get the differences between AMAs quite well. It's those policy assumptions that drive a lot of these models, and how are those comparing? How do those compare across Harquahala, Phoenix, Tucson, Canal? Recognizing that there are differences, but I think for folks here to have a good understanding or be able to make recommendations, it would be helpful to at least have those types of assumptions outlined, so that where the problems come from in Canal, where do we learn from that? What is causing that, and where do we take away, so that your statement that says the other AMAs are going to have this problem in the future, how do we avoid that?
Understood. And unless Aisha has anything, I see your point, and those assumptions, those kind of things do need to be spelled out. So.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add, and thank you, Sandy, for that. I think that's really those are important points. I would just say, things like removal of long-term storage credits that aren't pledged to an assured water supply determination. That's something that's in statute, and that is something that should be happening across the board in all of the modeling that's done. And it's my understanding that it is our director's intent to make assumptions like that and the CGRD replenishment treated the same to the extent that makes sense, when you're looking outside of statutory requirements across all of the AMAs.
Very good. And then just also Sharon Megdal in the chat noted that she would also like to better understand the assumptions about the long-term storage credits. And then Simone included some of the assumptions, or noted where one could find assumptions related to the Pinal model. At this point, why don't we bring down the PowerPoint and just where we can see all of those that do happen to have their cameras on. So it feels a little bit like we're all together. And just wanted to see here in the last 15 minutes that we have, are there any other ideas or thoughts in regards to what we have been talking about, of how ideas of how the assured water supply program could be strengthened, or issues that you'd like us to be looking at a little bit more on? Next meeting in August, we will be talking about unreplenished groundwater withdrawal, which I think we'll start seeing a connection between that and this issue. But right now, is there any other thoughts? Terry Sue, you have a suggestion.
Yeah, I would like for us to consider facilitating the transfer of long-term storage credits and groundwater associated with groundwater ranches from outside of an AMA into an AMA, and I'm talking specifically about the Pinal AMA. So we've been trying to explore some of those options, and we're finding, I don't know, it just seems like every angle we turn, there's some reason why we can't do whatever that option is. And so I'd like for us to specifically look at long-term storage credits that are stored outside of the AMA that you're in, and groundwater stored at, say, out in Harquahela, or say at McMullen or Butler Valley, or some open basin, and the ability for people to be able to bring those supplies into an AMA like Pinal, where there is no longer physical availability, at least according to the model.
Okay. Rob, you had a related question?
Yeah, to what Terry Sue was saying, and I'm not sure I fully understand this, but if you were to to acquire a supply like, say, Harquahela, as a developer, and you were to arrange for it to be transported through the canal, through Wheeling, through the canal, is it as simple as just delivering that to like an Arizona water company, or do you still have a physical availability issue there? You deliver it to Arizona Water, and then they store it in a GSF or whatever, and then you're relying on pumped groundwater. Is it that simple, or are there some obstacles there that we need to look at?
So I don't know if Aisha or Jeff want to give a quick response on that, or if that's a bigger discussion.
So you're talking about this. Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
No, go ahead, Aisha.
Okay,
probably you.
I just wanted to clarify the option you're talking about.
I'm trying to get at, normally in the subdivision development of the Pinal AMA, there's a groundwater system, and today Arizona Water imports CAP water and stores it at GSFs. I'm just trying to get, is it that simple? If you were to acquire a Harquahela supply, wheel it through the CAP canal, deliver it to Arizona Water for inclusion in its overall system, or is there do you have to build a separate treatment plant that serves that development specifically?
I think that's the kind of thing that we need to take back and dive into.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that's a complicated question.
But I do think, Rob, that's an example of what I'm kind of referring to. So if we went to the trouble of bringing a water supply from some other location and tried to bring it into the AMA, we would actually experience problems on both ends, whether or not we could even, say, acquire long-term storage credits, say out at Vidler or something like that. And then if we brought it into the AMA, would we have to have it in a separate parallel system, and we couldn't commingle it into our own system? And, you know, so it's like this, I don't even know what to how really to describe it. It's almost like this system has become so rigid that it's very hard to really find any sort of a solution. And in every solution that you pursue, it's not long before you end up hitting a wall. So I'd like for us to, you know, if we're being expected to go out and spend, you know, like if you went and got Vidler, you'd probably pay $80 million for that water supply, only to find that if you brought it into the Pinal AMA, you couldn't actually use it unless you were to use it directly and you isolated your surface water system from your groundwater system.
So are you recommending that as an option for us, for the group to look at? I mean that's what I think what Warren and Cheryl are looking for. So that's I hear that it's troublesome, but is it something that we might want to look at?
Yeah, I would like for us to, when we're talking about strengthening the Assured Water Supply Program, I mean, I guess probably there should be a conversation about what we even mean by strengthening. You know, in my mind, strengthening the Assured Water Supply Program would be to stabilize it, you know, to create a regulatory structure that's possible to follow. I think at this point, the program is destabilized to the point of where it is not possible to even comply with the rules, even when you try. And so what I'd like to do is look at that particular option of bringing water supplies from other groundwater basins. How do you bring them into the Pinal AMA and then actually be able to use them? I mean, it's one thing to require the use of renewable supplies, but it's another to have a bunch of, you know, other little rules that prevent the use of the supply.
So Terry Sue, maybe another way of saying it is that at least it would be helpful if we had a better understanding or at least an awareness of the roadblocks or well, I'll just say roadblocks might not be the right term, but roadblocks that are preventing that one could run into in acquiring a supply outside of the AMA in an intention to bring it in. And that could be everything from just actually acquiring the supply, but also to the points that you're talking about, what other things make it difficult to bring it in.
Yeah, and I go one step further than, you know, I mean, I think we can certainly identify some of those things, but what I'm saying is a way to strengthen the program is to create a pathway for these water supplies to actually be used. That's the focus of the solution that I'd like to the group to consider.
So let's I know we've got a few other. Doug, you had a comment or a suggestion.
Yeah, actually, the conversation kind of drifted right into what I was going to suggest. I really think we need to, you know, given the department's own presentation here, that, you know, we may be facing similar situations in the other AMAs that we're facing in Pinal. We have historically in the past been able to bring in non-groundwater supplies into a groundwater-based system, and that these commingled supplies then were able to be applied to an assured water supply. More recently, the department, because of the commingling, has had a lot of issues with that. I think we need to address that, and whether it is, as Terry Sue suggested, importation from outside of the AMA, and each of those sources are going to have their own unique problems. But once we get it inside the AMA, what do we do with it? Once we have water renewable supplies in the AMA, such as existing recharge credits, be they reclaim, be they CAP, be they other sources, how can we get a hold of those credits and then bring them into a commingled groundwater system and make that available for assured water supply? if the department's telling us that canal is done as far as new groundwater, and they fully expect this to happen in all the other AMAs, we got to figure out how to make this work. And so just because you started off on groundwater, then that totally prohibits you from bringing any new renewable supplies in to continue to grow. I think it would be contrary to the basic framework of the program, goal of the program, et cetera. So I think it's, you know, to condense all that down, renewable supplies in a mixed groundwater-based system.
Okay. And then Rob, I didn't mean to, but I skipped over you. You had a question. No, you're good? Okay. Krista, you had a question or a comment about existing credits.
Yeah, just in the context of Terry Sue's comments about importing credits from outside the AMA, I think we need to talk through the issues and the benefits of using credits that already exist in the AMA. So I don't want to leave that topic without working through the details of it.
Okay. And then Jake Lenderking, you had a point you wanted to share.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. And thanks for the dialogue. I think it's really meaningful and very important. I really like the 401 declaration of policy. I actually share that every time I give a presentation to outside groups about water in Arizona. I think it's profound what we declared in Arizona 40 years ago is, I think it's great. And I'm actually presenting on it tomorrow. And I was looking at that slide earlier today. And then going on more specific to this and where Terry Sue started, I really think we have a habit of trying to look at how we can regulate and make things harder. And you know, the auspice of the title, you know, groundwater and the assured water supply program has that negative connotation. But I think Terry Sue started breaking it down really well. Can we start looking at the barriers to doing something else? I think it would be great if we through this analysis and through this work, find ways to let economic development happen in the state of Arizona as easy as it has historically on groundwater. We made and built a process to develop on groundwater to happen fairly easy. Waters of the state, right? And now if we're talking about other waters, it'd be great if we spent a little bit of time on all of those different barriers, whether they're the long-term storage credits from outside the AMA, inside the AMA, commingled water systems, or just wells on the edge of the basin. All of these things preclude us from moving forward. I think it'd be great if we dove into those. As we solve those, we'll find the resolution to growing on groundwater and the assured water supply program fairly easy. I don't think anyone wants to leave the basins dry. And if we end up with alternative solutions, we'll fix the groundwater problem pretty easy. Thanks.
So thank you, Jake. And Michelle, I'm going to let you share your comment rather than me read it, if that's okay.
Yes, can you hear me, Warren? I'm having technical difficulties.
Yes, we can hear you. If something happens, I'll be glad to read your comment, but please go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay. I think I'm probably a broken record on these issues, but I have been thinking about how to get new sustainable water supplies to developments for a long time. And one of the significant problems and barriers that we have to doing so is the Department of Water Resources has traditionally required for water providers the volumetric accounting policy, which is an unwritten policy that essentially I want to say infects every water that goes into a water provider with a portion of whatever water is in that system. And so if I was to say get Colorado River water and dedicate it to a water provider to serve my development, and I wanted the water provider to just take it and serve me, the department's policy would require that the water provider peanut butter it all over their system, and I'd never get it to the development. So I would like to make whatever changes we have to rules or statutes to make it clear that a water provider can take a dedicated water source, own it, get it through their system, and serve it to a specific development. for assured water supply purposes at least, but also for other purposes, so that we encourage sustainable supplies to get to new development. And so that's something that you may be seeing me offer again at the Water Rump Group. I've done it before. I would also, if we need to, we may not need to because I think the statutes are fairly clear, but they could be more clear that a water provider could use its own recovery well permit to withdraw credits owned by others for them. I think the statutes kind of already anticipate that can happen, but if we need to clarify that, that's something we should put on our list to give water providers and others maximum ability to use stored water, which is going to be becoming even more important in our shortages approaching. And then finally, I also added a comment below that I think we should think ahead to what potable reuse is going to look like for assured water supply purposes. I haven't yet had a project that used it, but I think, you know, when you go in with a direct potable reuse plan, do we need rule changes to recognize the quantity of savings that will cause through reuse? Do we need to have, you know, what level of infrastructure needs to be in place has always been an issue for certificates, especially. You know, do we need to equalize certificates and designations and the standards that are applicable to how far along the infrastructure needs to be in order to get the certificate? There are lots of issues we can look at for direct potable reuse.
Thanks, Michelle, for that's a good point to raise.
Who's making a list? Who's making a list of these points? Who's taking the notes that is listing some of these things that we're talking about?
Cheryl and I are both making a list. ADWR staff's making a list, so we're taking notes. I'm busy.
It's also being recorded, so
you're going to check it twice and find out who's been naughty and who's been nice. Thank you very much.
Yes, most likely, Michael, we will do that. But Simone, you had a question?
Not really. I mean, it is a question, but it wasn't a question I was asking to be answered today. Mostly, that was kind of a part B of the discussion about bringing long-term storage credits in from outside the AMA. I just think that addressing the question about the existing UNDEP, specifically within the Pinal AMA, but possibly the same would be true in the future in other AMAs. I'm just curious how the existing unmet demand for long-term storage credits within the AMA would be impacted by bringing them in from outside. So, but that doesn't need to be addressed now, just whenever the discussion is.
Okay. Thanks. And then Terry Sue had a comment. I'll just go ahead here and just say that another way to strengthen the assured water supply program is to allow anyone to create and purchase long-term storage credits. Right now, water providers who pump excess groundwater cannot create or even purchase long-term storage credits. I don't know. I know that's been a outstanding debate. I don't know if the department wants to provide any brief comment at this time, or we'll just add that onto the list.
I think we just add that to the list.
Okay. So it's 3:03 and want to be respectful of all of your time. I'm a little hesitant because it's been such a good conversation and a lot of good questions, but in respect of everyone's time, want to say thank you for participating today, giving your thoughts. Don't be shy between now and the next meeting. If there's thoughts that you want to share with Cheryl and I, please do so. And I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl to have the last word and wrap it up.
Thank you, Warren. And this has been a great discussion. A lot of solutions, a lot of questions that were actually solutions, as someone pointed out. So there's a lot for us to sort through when we circle back. As we talked about, our next meeting is going to be August 10th. It's going to focus on unreplenished groundwater withdrawals. In the meantime, if you do have other suggestions on today's topic, I think it's best if you email Warren and me both. That way we have it equally. And I'm open to other suggestions on that, but as well, Warren, we'll be circulating. Do we circulate minutes at this meeting? How do we normally do this? Okay, so when we come back to this in the fall, we'll just have this list and then we'll go from there.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And
This has been great.
Have a good rest of your day and stay cool.
Thank you.